So thanks for coming out on this wonderful, humid Houston day. My name is John Barr, and I'm the History and Humanities professor here at Lone Star College-Kingwood, and the chair of our Curious Minds Committee, which invites authors to campus. And I met Steve at the San Antonio Book Festival last spring after he gave a talk on this book, and he agreed to come to campus, and we're just thrilled to have him here. So this is a talk about issues of faith and reason, and here you see a slide of what John Paul II thought of Fatima. And this series of ours, the Curious Minds series that invites authors to campus, is premised on the idea that reading and reasoning is an important part of a well-lived life, and that books are a vehicle for a well-lived life and a great pleasure. Okay, so Stephen Hartigan is a Texas-raised novelist, journalist, and screenwriter. A longtime writer for Texas Monthly, his work has also appeared in The Atlantic, the New York Times Book Review, and National Geographic. He has authored 12 books. I've got a couple of them here. One, A Natural State, Essays on Texas. Another is this book, A Big, Wonderful Thing, about the history of Texas. And you can see if Texas is a big state, this is a big book. And Steve Davis and I, Steve teaches Texas history. I've been encouraging Steve Davis to make that his textbook in his Texas history class.
Makes sense.
And then this is his book, his novel on the Alamo, The Gates of the Alamo. And he also has a book on Abraham Lincoln, a fictionalized novel, and that's one I've got to read still, since Lincoln is my specialty. At any rate, Steve has authored 12 books, earning various awards and a multitude of positive reviews. He is also the author of acclaimed screenplays appearing on HBO, TNT, and the Hallmark Channel, earning Writers Guild and Humanitas Prize nominations for his work. He's a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin. Don't hold that against him, A&M graduates. Okay, Harrigan earned his degree in 1970 and went on to teach for 2 decades at UT's James A. Michener Center for Writers. His contributions to literature and education have been recognized with the Texas Medal of Arts, the Lon Tinkle Award for Lifetime Achievement, and induction into the Texas Literary Hall of Fame. So let's give Stephen Hartigan a warm welcome. Thank you. Okay, so the first question that I wanted to ask you, Steve, and that is, why and how did you balance the intimate story of Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta with the political and spiritual calamities of the 20th century?
Boy, it's a big question
for a small book.
Right. Thank you for having me, John, and to everyone here at Lone Star College. It's great to be at this. It's the first time I've been here. I've been to other campuses, but it's a wonderful place to visit. I appreciate it. The story. This is a story. This book is about an event that happened. This is kind of a long way around to your question.
Right.
This is an event that happened in 1917 in Fatima, Portugal, with 3 children, Lucia Santos and her cousins Jacinta and Francisco Marto. These 3 shepherd children were out in a field one day, and they claimed that the Virgin Mary appeared to them on top of a little sort of a stunted oak tree. And this led to a series of apparitions that on the 13th day of each month, the lady, the Virgin Mary, said to them, they said that she was going to appear on the 13th day of each month for 6 months, and ultimately at the end of that apparition cycle, she would perform a miracle. And this became a giant thing. I mean, we're talking about a very remote sort of hill country village in Portugal, which had been, where 90% of the female population at least was illiterate, very, very deeply Catholic at a very troubled time in Portugal. And so it represented in some ways a resurgence of the Catholic faith, which had been suppressed by a Republican government, secular government. And I began, to answer your question more directly, what interested me about it, why this has the subtitle of the Shepherd Children of Fatima and the fate of the 20th century, is because all the events that followed, or that were concurrent with it, seemed to be kind of markers for important events of that century. This happened during the rise of the communist revolution in Russia. It happened during World War I. 2 of the 3 children died as a result of the flu pandemic of 1918. This was a century of assassinations and assassination attempts. There was an assassination attempt made on the Pope that sort of had something to do with Fatima. Right. There was a skyjacking that involved Fatima. And so as I began to think about this book, or about the story I wanted to tell, first and foremost was the story of these 3 children, which I found, truly powerful and heartbreaking. And then there was the story of a century kind of embedded into these events. So that's as close as I can answer that question.
No. And that gives you a good idea of all the different types of topics that are in the book. It's not just about these visions, but it's also about, assassinations and flus and pandemics and skyjackings and everything else. And so you get a good sense of the lives of these children as well as the 20th century too. Next slide, Leah, if you don't mind. Yes, so there it gives you a photograph there of some extent. So you have to tell the story of this miracle in the book, and you stage that scene so very well in the book. How did you do that without making a statement on whether or not you believe it had actually happened or not? You kind of seemed to thread a needle there that was very interesting.
Yeah, this is a book. I hope this is, a very respectful book about faith, but it's not a believer's book about these events. I grew up extremely Catholic. Any Catholics in the audience? Well, maybe some of you will relate to some of these experiences, but I grew up in the 50s and 60s, one of the reasons I wanted to write this book was because even though the events that took place in Portugal in 1917 and thereafter were as foreign to me as they could be in a lot of ways. I grew up in suburban Corpus Christi and Abilene and then Corpus Christi. And so, I lived a kind of, suburban life, but we lived a very Catholic life. And what was so remarkable to me in reading about these children was that you could have taken me before Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, when in 1960 and 61, when the rites of the Catholic Church changed from Latin to English and all sorts of cosmetic things changed. You could have taken me and put me in that mountain village in Portugal and put me in that church, and I would have known all those hymns, I would have known all those prayers. Mm-hmm. I would have been totally at home in this very remote and foreign place. And so I understood these children, I felt. I understood, the ringleader of these 3 children was Lucia. She was 10 years old when these events happened. And I remembered being 10 years old and being sort of steeped in Catholicism and ritual and mystery and majesty of that religion, and believing the Virgin Mary was going to appear to me sometime, because it just was, you're sort of primed for that. And, so if you're an imaginative child, living in that environment, it just any 10-year-old kid is going to be filled with imaginations and sort of internal prophecies and stuff like that. And so I understood these kids. Right. And as I got older and as I kind of drifted away from the church for various reasons we could talk about or not, I kept remembering the stories we heard about Fatima, particularly the stories that the nuns told us about the Fatima letter, which is also referred to as the third part of the Secret of Fatima, where Lucia, who was then 10 at the time, said that they had received 3 secrets, and 2 of which were kind of not really secrets, but one of which, she said, nobody could reveal. And when she was finally ordered by her bishop, and she became a nun, and she was the only surviving member of this trio, when she became a nun, she wrote down the secret at the request, or actually the order of her bishop, and wrote on the envelope not to be opened until 1960. So I was in school in the late 50s, in elementary school, living in abject terror about nuclear annihilation, because that was the height of the Cold War. And so we all thought, okay, this letter, there's a prophecy, it's going to tell us our fate. So 1960 came, and we asked the nun who was teaching us, what did the letter say? And she said, well, the Pope opened it, said it was too horrible for anybody to read, and put it back in the envelope. So that was like crushing news, because we figured it was not only were we going to be annihilated, but those of us who were kind of not right with God, in the sense that I wasn't making. There were things that you had to go to confession and confess your sins, and there were some sort of thought crimes, about impure thoughts, they called them, that I didn't want to confess. So that meant you were in a state of mortal sin, which meant you were going to hell. So not only were you being bombed into oblivion, but you were going to hell for all eternity. So it was a very nervous time. And I forgot about the letter, the Fatima letter, for a long time. But part of what made me want to write this book was, what was that all about? What did that say? And why were people so concerned about it? And why did it have such an impact on so many Catholics throughout much of the century?
Yeah, I wonder if we have those types of dreads and fears today. Do you think?
I think we had duck and cover, but now kids have shooting, drills. So it's I think childhood is a nervous time anyway.
That's true. So we often, our students will often take trips overseas and do a study abroad in classes. And do you think that going to Fatima, if they went to Portugal, would be worth their time?
Absolutely. I mean, going anywhere is worth your time. I think, that's one of the things I've learned in my career as a writer and as a journalist, is like, go places, and no matter how far or how near it is, there's always something to discover. But certainly Fatima is, on the surface, it might not be so interesting unless you know the story, because it's a kind of, the city itself, or the small city, is unremarkable in some ways until you get to what used to be called the Cova da Iria, which was the field where Lucia and her cousins were grazing their sheep. And it's now a giant basilica, religious complex with one basilica on one end and another newer basilica on the other end. And 5 million people come there every year.
5 million?
5 million.
Wow.
And it is a very powerful pilgrimage site. And whether you're a believer or not, to be in contact with that world, with that level of faith intensity, is truly moving. I mean, these people, a lot of the people who come there, I'm sure, are very devout Catholics, but a lot of them, I think, are just sort of curious people who wonder what this is all about. And the atmosphere of sacredness and of hope and of compassion is really, really something to observe and participate in if you feel inclined. So I was, both from a historical point of view and from a emotional point of view, it was a very powerful experience to me.
This is the next question I had, and I would say this to everybody in the audience, that somehow you'd walk a tightrope between appealing to believers and skeptics in this book at the same time, and I wanted to know how you managed that. Because I feel like it's a very fair book. If you're a believing Catholic, it's very fair to your point of view, and I think if you're a skeptic, it also walks that balance. So how did you go about that process? What
Well,
challenges did you face?
I think I went about it understanding that I've been both those things. I grew up for most of my life as a, and most of my childhood anyway, as a devout, believing, or I thought I was a believing Catholic, and then I drifted away and started thinking for myself and questioning things, and but I come from these, Catholicism it's my DNA. I mean, and you don't have to think too hard about that. It's home base for me, So I did not want to trash the Catholic Church or religion in general. I wanted to tell a story. And this is part of this is memoir, by the way. So it's a historical narrative, and about a third of it is memoir. And I wanted to tell the parts of it that were about me as truthfully as I could, and to remember the parts of me that so deeply responded to the mythology and the rituals of the church, and to the hopes and fears of living in that world. And so I didn't come to throw cold water on anybody's beliefs.
Yeah.
I came to examine. There's a phrase in Catholicism: it's examine your conscience. And I guess without me knowing it, that's what I was always doing.
Yeah.
Am I being fair? Am I being honest? And I couldn't have written a devotional book. That would not have been honest. But I could be fair, and I could be, I could talk to people who truly believed in these events, and their lives were changed by them or even ruled by them. So it wasn't a difficult thing to do. It was just kind of keeping tabs on who I am and how and to be as accurate as possible in terms of reporting the events.
Okay. We've kind of touched on the next two questions, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. And this is a question, Steve, about you obviously value the importance of going places. And so have you ever attended Mass in any of the Spanish missions that were founded in Texas?
Yeah.
Have you?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Which ones have you done?
San Jose, and I think maybe in Espada once.
Okay. What is it?
Picture right there, as a matter of fact.
Oh, is that right?
Oh, is that Espada?
Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What's your reaction to doing that emotionally?
Well, again, it's part of my DNA. So I have a tricky relationship with Catholicism in some ways, and in other ways, a very comfortable relationship with it. So when I walk into a place like one of the Spanish missions here, one of the churches that are still active and still, I do feel a sense of being in a place that's very familiar among people whose beliefs I understand, if I don't necessarily share them.
Right.
I've been to places like the Shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City, which is 20 million people visit that place a year, and the sort of overpowering sense of belief and devotion is familiar to me.
Right.
And the deeper it goes in terms of Spanish colonial history, which goes so far back to the conquests of the Aztecs in 1519. I mean, it just the complexity and weirdness in some ways of those ceremonies are really striking. So I think it's a way different experience, I think, to go to a Catholic church that was built 10 years ago, and go to a Spanish colonial church like one of the missions, and even though the Mass has changed, it's in English, and it's the priest is facing the congregation rather than facing the altar and all the other things. You do feel a sense of that old world, medieval,
Right.
quality that was part of my experience growing up.
So you would advise our students to go to one of those masses then?
Absolutely. Go to, one of the great things to do if you haven't done it is take your bike, if you have one, or rent a bike, or go on a walk, and go on the Mission Trail in San Antonio.
Right.
You can start at not Espada, but San Juan Concepcion, I think, San Juan Capistrano, and you can ride your bike. It's like about a 16-mile round trip, I think, but you stop at each mission, and then you end at the Alamo, which is a mission,
Right.
and then you ride back, and it's a really beautiful experience. You
Right.
get a very interesting sense of how deep the history in Texas goes.
I remember my wife and I did that.
Did you?
It was. It's and we forget that San Antonio was that type of place for so many years. Steve, you had a question?
Something that wasn't on our agenda when John and I talked about this, but relates to the Spanish mission, the Alamo. I think another place where you've had to, in your writings, try to walk that tightrope and balance faith and skepticism is the death of Davy Crockett. So could you talk about that a little bit? Because I happen to be teaching that in one class right now.
Really?
We'll get to it in some others eventually.
Yeah, well, this is, we're still, you'd think that is a secular issue, but it's more like a religious issue for a lot of people, because it was, how did Davy Crockett, okay, the reason we talk about Davy Crockett, and people my age have no problem remembering who he is, or what a big impact he had on our childhood, because in 1955 there was a series on TV. It became a movie called Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier, that was like Harry Potter. It just completely galvanized a whole generation. And in that, this is a long answer to your question, Stephen. In that movie, you see Davy Crockett, swinging his rifle as the Mexican army is advancing, and I think it traumatized a generation, because it was the first movie we'd ever seen where the hero died, and it was sort of upsetting, to like a 6-year-old kid, 7-year-old kid like me. And so many years later, a document surfaced, a narrative written by a Mexican lieutenant colonel, which was translated into English, and which said basically that Crockett had been one of like 6 or 7 people who had been captured at the Alamo and then subsequently executed. This got interpreted as Davy Crockett surrendered. So
Right.
to that group of kids, who were invested in this sort of heroic image, the idea of surrender was, that can't happen.
Right.
So there became this long-running controversy that many books have been written about this, about exactly how Davy Crockett died. And the short answer is, I don't know, and nobody does. But the interesting thing is that people want to believe so hard in these mythic figures, and that I've seen people almost come to blows over this issue. Like, was he swinging his rifle when he died, or was he ignominiously executed? I mean, who cares? But it's a really, he was still, he was still killed in battle basically, and still fighting for whatever cause he was believing in. And so it's just one of those resonant historical mysteries. And I'd love to hear your lecture about it, to hear how you're...
Oh, it's okay. It just seems to me, and I don't mean to be too critical, you try to finesse the issue.
Yeah.
You do it by saying that ultimately, what ultimately matters is that he was killed at the Alamo.
Right.
But I think there's a realization that it's kind of a no-win proposition in
Right.
terms of if you come down too hard on one side or the other.
Yeah. It's just, look at the facts, look at the sources, and with anything, and then just be honest. You don't have to take a side in everything. And I think we're in a time, of course, as all you know, of intense polarization, where you're being forced to from one extreme to the other, and just do the reading, do the reporting, do the research, listen to people, and you'll usually come away with a sense of what's reasonable. And many times, what's reasonable is I don't know, and that's that's how I kind of thread that particular need.
We've got another question
I
right
was
here.
just wondering, in San Antonio, in the church in the square, there's a memorial that supposedly has Crockett's remains.
Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. In San Fernando Cathedral and on the main plaza of San Antonio. San Fernando Cathedral used to be the main church in San Antonio. It was there during the time of the Alamo, and there's a little sort of sarcophagus that sort of says these are the remains of the heroes of the Alamo or something like that. Not quite true. There were, nobody knows exactly how many Alamo defenders died, somewhere around, 200, 250 probably. And they were burned, their bodies were burned in these 3 funeral pyres afterward by Santa Ana. And their ashes were gathered up and taken to given burial by Juan Seguin, who was one of the Tejano defenders of the Alamo, and somehow I think some of those ashes may have ended up in that sarcophagus, but to say that they belong to anybody in particular, or to everybody.
It says that they were, I think,
It does? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been a while since I've looked at it.
remains of Canadians, whatever.
Yeah.
Any other audience questions at this point? Go ahead.
You mentioned interviewing people. Obviously, the memoirs from your point of view, but for the historical things, what kind of resources did you use to be able to write your book?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of there are a lot of books about Fatima. They're mostly written by people who are complete believers in the events that happen and the spiritual events that happen. But they're very useful because a lot of them were written by several priests who interviewed Lucia and Jacinta and Francisco and their parents. And so there's a record, and those are, some of them are kind of filtered through books that these people wrote, but they're also compiled in a big, giant, anthology of primary sources about Fatima, which is in Portuguese, but I could kind of make my way through it somewhat. And then there are, I went there and I interviewed the head librarian of the Fatima, library. I interviewed a couple other people who knew the history, and I asked them afterward if they would read the book and let me know if they encountered any errors of not of judgment, but of fact or accuracy. So there's newspaper accounts, there's photographs, there's a lot of, there's one guy who wrote a 3-volume history. Each volume is about 800 or 900 pages long.
Wow.
And every source is identified there. And so that was very useful to me. It took a long time to read it, but I used that extensively along with a lot of other stuff.
Can you talk a little bit about the importance of Kennedy to a young child growing up in Texas during the Cold War?
Oh, yeah.
And your experience and emotions upon hearing about his death?
Yeah, President Kennedy, you're talking
Yes,
about,
I meant,
John
yes,
Kennedy?
yes.
A lot of Kennedys around these days. When I was, when I was a young kid, and this was in, Kennedy was running for president in 1960 or 59, and it's hard to remember now how somewhat ostracized Catholics were in normal society. Catholicism was perceived as a kind of cult. And even though huge numbers of people were Catholics, there had never been a Catholic president. So when Kennedy, who was a Catholic, Irish Catholic, announced he was running for president, he was met with a lot of skepticism that basically he was a tool of the Pope, And I encountered our family, we were for Kennedy because we were, Democrats, and there was a Catholic running for office.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in my totally juvenile way, one day we went out and campaigned for him. We got some stickers and stuff, and I encountered a woman who just was so angry at me because I was like a stalking horse of the Pope, and I'd never even thought about that. I never even thought that people thought one way or another about
Right.
Catholics, but it was an eye-opening thing for me. And then he was assassinated, and that was it was. Again, it depends on how old you are, I think, when these things happen. I was I 12? I think, no, 14. And one of my, it was a national trauma. The Charlie Kirk murder of a couple of weeks ago was a national trauma. And this was that times 10, I think, in a lot of ways. And, young guy who was in his 40s, brutally murdered, in Dallas. And it had a huge impact on everybody, but particularly, I think, on impressionable young people, who had never experienced a national upheaval like that, which was, on a par, of course, later we had Martin Luther King's assassination, Robert Kennedy's assassination, then 9/11, I mean, and we're, not that we're used to these upheavals, but as the older you get, the more you can look back and look at these sort of markers and see how it changed the country.
So and for everybody in the room, there's a fair amount in the book about Pope John Paul the 23rd and the Vatican reforms of the early 60s. What did you think of the recent movie Conclave? I don't know if other people have seen this in here.
Anybody?
And what do you think about the new Pope being an American?
Well, to answer your second question first, it's so weird to have an American Pope, isn't it? I mean, it's like the guy's from Chicago. I mean, it's just so strange to see a guy dressed up like that, talking, American English, and because it's the first time ever there's been an American Pope, and only a few times there's been a non-Italian Pope. So it's a striking change of tone, I think, and I don't know in terms of policy or anything important. I don't know I don't know if he'll be, more like a reformer or more like a custodian. I don't know.
Yeah.
But those issues were playing out in Conclave. Did everybody, or many of you see Conclave?
How many of y'all seen Conclave? Yeah.
I mean, it's a pretty interesting, it's an exciting movie, but it's a real glimpse into this strange world of all these cardinals, trying to decide who the next pope will be. And it's a kind of suspense movie in a way. I really liked it. I thought it was, I can't attest to its accuracy. Nobody ever made me a cardinal, and I've never been in an environment where I had to vote for the Pope, but it felt pretty interesting.
For those of you who like historical fiction, the author of Conclave is a man named Robert Harris. He's an Englishman, and he writes historical novels. And anything you read by him is pretty good. Yeah. He actually, one of his first books was called Fatherland, which was a book that assumed that, did the thought experiment that the Nazis won World War II, and how would that have shaped our history had that been the case. He's a very interesting author, Robert Harris. So what did you learn about Portugal and the importance of the 3 F's in Portugal: football, fado, and Fatima, as Steve says, during that country's long dictatorship? And do you see any of that around the globe today, not just in Portugal?
Yeah, I mean, we live in, that was a time of upheaval, the early part of the 20th century. We're talking about the Russian Revolution. There was a Portuguese Revolution. The king had been assassinated a few years before. The monarchy had come to an end. There was this, fervency to embrace the modern world, which meant, sidelining, medieval religions.
Right.
And it was a really tumultuous time, and Lucia and Jacinta and Francisco were in the middle of it. You know, they were. This was a time when everybody had to keep their heads down, particularly if you were Catholic, and then you had these three children saying, "Hey, wait a minute, the Virgin Mary just appeared to us," and so that was a threat to Lucia's family, because you know, her mother never believed that this had happened, and it also put them in the crosshairs of this you know, new secular administration, which was bearing down on these kinds of beliefs, and so she was a threat, you know, and a threat to the church to some degree as well, because you know, it can make the church more of a target in this environment. And as these apparitions continued for 6 months, you know, the first one was just the three children. Then there were like, you know, 15 or 20 people at the next one. By the time the final apparition took place, there were like somewhere between 40 to 70,000 people. Nobody's ever said exactly how many.
Well, we saw the photo
Yeah,
earlier.
right. I mean, just that field where Lucia's family depended on its livelihood was just trampled into mud. That's now the religious center at Fatima. So it was a very dangerous time, and in fact, at one point, the secular administrator of that area kidnapped the children before there could be another apparition, and according to Lucia in her memoirs, he threatened to fry them in oil unless she revealed the secret. Now, I'm not sure how totally true that is, but it was true that they were abducted. And so, you know, it was really scary. And you know, they built a little chapel where the apparition had happened, and that was bombed. You know, so it was a frightening time. And Lucy herself was sort of hustled out of town by the bishop when she turned 13. And sent off to this school in Porto, and she couldn't read. You know, she was illiterate, and she was sort of mocked for being a kind of mountain girl, as they called her.
Right. Go ahead.
Yeah, as a non-Catholic, I'm curious to know, when you say appear to the children or the apparition happened later with more people, what does it really mean?
It depends on whether you believe or not. I mean, I don't want to have to keep qualifying it by saying, she said that there was an apparition, but that's what the truth was, because here's the reality. Lucia and Jacinta were the only ones who could see. I mean, nobody could see the Virgin Mary except them. Francisco could hear her voice. They said. I mean, again, you could just insert "they said" into everything I'm saying now. So there. But there were people who believed they were literally talking to this invisible being. You know, there were, you know, tens of thousands of people who were there at that final apparition, where there was a supposed miracle in the sky. And they saw these three children kneeling and their lips moving, speaking to this invisible entity. And so that's what the apparition was. I mean, it was three children saying this was happening or had happened, and it was, you know, thousands of people believing that they were telling the truth. And what happened at that final apparition, you know, again, supposed apparition, depending on your faith spectrum, there was something called, you know, the miracle of the sun, where the sun appeared to dance in the sky and to sort of fall to earth. And everyone believed that was the miracle that the Virgin Mary had promised. Now, everybody was there expecting a miracle, so they were in this state of heightened, you know, intensity. You know, a miracle was going to happen. And when they got there to this field, it was pouring down rain, everybody was drenched, you know, and suddenly, you know, sometimes during a rainstorm, the sun will come out and the sky will clear somewhat suddenly. That happened. And Lucia was kneeling in front of this invisible apparition, and she said, "Look at the sky." So you have thousands of people who are there, who are believers, who are expecting a miracle, and then you have this little girl saying, "Here it is." And they all looked up at the sky, and the sun, there was this brilliance in the sky. The sun was sharply delineated. They were looking at the sun, and when you do that, your eyes can kind of do weird things. And so it was perceived by, I don't know if it was perceived by everybody there, but by a lot of people there as a miracle. And that was Our Lady saying, "I'm real, I can do these things." So, yeah.
Yes, I have been to Portugal and Lisbon specifically. There's a resistance museum there that talks
Yeah,
about
I've
the
been there.
dictatorship.
Yeah.
And I think my question is these three things, football, Fado, and Fatima. My understanding is those were used as distractions for the people so that they wouldn't think about the control over them by the dictatorship. They
Well,
could focus on other things, their religion, their sports, their music.
And the big reason for that was that Salazar, the long-running dictator, was a devout Catholic, whereas the secular government that had been in power was not Catholic at all, was not religious at all. But then they were overthrown, and another guy, Pais, is it Pais, Steve, or Sidonio?
After Salazar?
Yeah, no, before Salazar. After, anyway.
Salazar came to power about 1920.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to remember.
The guys before him.
Pais, the guy who was assassinated.
Yeah.
Anyway, a religious guy came to power, in like 1819. He was assassinated. The government was overthrown something like 40 times before Salazar came in and steadied it. And he was perceived by some as a benevolent dictator. And football, Fado, and Fatima, you're right, were ways of kind of calming the masses and making it, distracting them, I guess, in a way.
What other audience questions do we have at this stage? Go ahead.
So how did this actually take place? The three children saw an image, they went and ran to their priest, nun, and told them, and then what happened after that? Did they have to wait for the Vatican to say, okay, this really happened, or what? How did it take off?
It took off in a very small way. Lucia said to the two kids, her two cousins, who were much younger, they were like 8 and 7, don't say a word of this to anybody. So they went home, and Jacinta, who's 7, of course she's a 7-year-old girl, she tells her parents, "Oh well, the Virgin Mary came," and so word got out, and Lucia's mother tried to squelch it, but it didn't work. It just kept getting out, and then people got curious, and then people came and wanted to interview them, wanted to talk to them, wanted them to intercede with the Virgin Mary for them, and it just kept growing and growing. And then the church was not a fan of this thing because, again, it was in the spotlight, it was in the crosshairs. But finally, it kind of gave its approval to the Fatima cult, if you want to call it that, in I think the 1930s, saying it was so okay to worship the Virgin of Fatima. It never really took a hard line one way or the other. And finally, when the letter was revealed, the famous Fatima letter, which was basically a kind of fever dream, that the church, I thought, still wanted to keep its distance from it because it was still trying to modernize. It was still trying to come into the 21st century, and this was throwing Catholicism back to that medieval world because it was like the Book of Revelations or it used to be called the Apocalypse in the Catholic Bible. So there's been a kind of awkward resistance on the part of the church to fully embrace Fatima, depending on who's Pope. And Pope John Paul II really did embrace it because, do we have time for me to tell you?
Probably got just enough time for you to explain that. Yeah.
Because in the letter, Lucia wrote that she saw a vision of the Pope being gunned down and killed. And in 1981, on May 13th, the date of the first apparition of Fatima, the Pope was in St. Peter's Square, gets gunned down by an assassin. He's a very devout believer in the Virgin Mary to begin with because of his Polish background. And so he says he survives this horrific assassination attempt. He's lying there in the Gemelli Hospital and says, let me see that letter again. So they show him the letter where, the Pope has been killed, and he believes that the Virgin Mary had guided the bullet away from his vital arteries and saved his life. And he then handed the bullet that almost killed him to the Bishop of Fatima and said, here's a gift from Our Lady. And the bishop had it welded into the crown of the statue of Our Lady of Fatima that's there today. So again, all these intersections with the 20th century stuff, that have.
John, I've got a perfect final question if we have
All
time
right,
for it.
that's fine.
It might seem frivolous, but it's in your book. What's your favorite color? Explain the answer to that.
Okay, yes, good question. I'm not the only one whose favorite color is blue, but in my experience, it goes back to the Virgin Mary herself. I mean, in the Catholic cosmology, there are some forbidding entities. God can be a little bit punishing, but the Virgin Mary was always depicted as this benevolent, consoling power. And usually she was depicted as wearing a blue mantle, And so when you're a little kid and you're frightened by all the stuff that you're being told about going to hell and all that, and you're looking for some reassuring figure, it's the Virgin Mary you go to. There's no accident that she's the one who keeps appearing to all these people all over the world. And so the fact that she was habitually wearing blue just kind of entered into my mental bloodstream, and blue's my favorite color. So I'm not wearing it today, sorry, but I've got some blue shoes.
Yeah. So I'm glad I am. Thank you, Steve, for coming. We
Thank you.
appreciate it. Let's give him a round of applause.